Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, please make sure that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as a courtesy. And for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions now or at any time in the future, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion this afternoon is Lindsay Burke. She serves as the Will Skillman Fellow in Education Policy here at Heritage, and she is also director of our Center for Education Policy. She, of course, researches and writes on federal and state education issues. She's primarily focused on reducing the federal role in education and empowering families with school choice for that choice of their own. Her commentary and research appears in major newspapers across the country, and she has spoken on education and reform issues as well around the nation. Please join me in welcoming Lindsay Burke. Lindsay?
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here. We are delighted to be joined today by Congressman Jim Banks and a great panel of experts to discuss the education experiences of military families and possible options for reform moving forward. We'll hear first from Congressman Banks, and then we'll have a panel discussion moderated by Inez Stepman of the American Legislative Exchange Council, where we'll hear about options for federal reform, survey data from an interesting new survey that was just released on active duty military families and veterans, and we'll hear the perspectives and experiences of those who are military connected themselves. But first, I would like to introduce Congressman Jim Banks. Congressman Banks represents Indiana's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressman Banks currently serves on the House Armed Services, Veterans Affairs, and Science, Space, and Technology Committees. Prior to being elected to the U.S. House, Congressman Banks served in the Indiana State Senate from 2010 to 2016. In the State Senate, he chaired the Senate Veteran Affairs and the Military Committee, and led the charge on many significant pro-growth, pro-family, and pro-veteran reforms. Congressman Banks serves in the U.S. Navy Reserve as a Supply Corps officer and took a leave of absence from the Indiana State Senate in both 2014 and 2015 to deploy to Afghanistan during Operations Enduring Freedom and Freedom Sentinel. He received the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for his military leadership in Afghanistan, and also received the American Legion's Distinguished Public Service Award in 2013, 14, and 16 for his work on behalf of veterans in Indiana. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Jim Banks.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. I am deeply honored to be here with you today. Thank you, Lindsay, for all of your great work. And thank you to the Heritage Foundation for all that you do to build and feed the conservative movement on Capitol Hill. I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to come and talk about a topic that I care a great deal about today, and talk about the benefits that school choice provides to hardworking families. As a Hoosier, I know that school choice works for families and communities. Let me borrow some statistics to help make the case. According to the organization formerly known as the Friedman Foundation, Ed Choice, there have been 15 studies analyzing the impact of school vouchers. Of those studies, 12 out of 15 demonstrated statistically significant positive academic gains for students. The data also shows that school choice programs also have a positive effect on nearby public schools. The Friedman Foundation, now known as Ed Choice, has examined the academic research on this topic and found that an overwhelming number of studies, 29 out of 31, show that school choice has a positive impact on the academic achievement in neighboring public schools. Despite what we constantly hear from opponents of school choice, it's important to note that none of these studies find a negative impact on public schools. During my time as a state senator in Indiana, I was on the front lines of the school choice movement. Every year I served in the state Senate, I served on the Senate Education Committee, where we fought the school choice fight in Indiana. We worked hard to advance what has become the largest school choice program in the country. We ushered in an expansion of charter schools and created the first statewide voucher program for low and middle income students in 2011. In the first year of the program, nearly 4,000 students utilized vouchers to escape failing public schools. In 2016, more than 34,000 low and middle income students participated in the voucher program, now known as the Indiana Choice Scholarship Program. Indiana is also home to 93 charter schools that educate over 43,000 Hoosier students and is ranked number 2 in the Center for Education Reform's Parental Power Index. The results are clear, as you can see. Test scores are up and graduation rates are at record highs. While the achievements are high, there is always room for improvement. An exciting idea, though, to segue, an exciting idea has become increasingly embraced by school choice advocates across the country, and that is of education savings accounts, or ESAs. Lindsay has written extensively on this topic for the Heritage Foundation. And as she well knows, ESAs allow for parents to completely customize their child's education. For example, parents could spend roughly 90% of their ESA on tuition and the rest on advanced online courses. ESAs are particularly useful for students with special needs requiring additional services that may not be available at most schools. Every child and family is different, and education policy should reflect those differences by giving every family complete control over how they spend their education dollars. As the most recently deployed member of Congress, though, I can say that that is particularly true for our military families. And if I could pause from my written remarks for a moment, we just completed Veterans Day weekend. Veterans Day is always a special time for us to thank our veteran population. It's a particularly awkward time for me, though, because like some of you in the room who served, you might get this same circumstance that I often get. On Veterans Day, I get the Facebook messages thanking me for my service. I got a free haircut at Great Clips. I got a free cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. I get a number of phone calls and text messages from friends and family members thanking me for my service. My wife doesn't have to say it, but she gives me that look. And we have a military spouse in the front row. She doesn't say a thing, but she gives me the look, and that look is completely clear to me because she knows that she's the one that did all the hard work while I got to go and have fun serving my country in uniform. So on Veterans Day, I've learned on a very personal note to thank our military spouses for their service, which is oftentimes much more important than the service of their loved ones while they're off supporting our country. And we have a military spouse you're going to hear from here in a little bit who's going to speak to you on the panel. And we thank you for your service very much as well. So while we think about our military spouses, though, and we think about the men and women who go off and deploy and the families that are oftentimes left at home, it's generally true that most Americans don't understand the link between education choice and the success of our military and the important work that goes on at home for families to take care of our families of loved ones while one is deployed. So as a Navy Reserve Supply Corps officer and the father of 3 beautiful daughters, I was lucky to not have this education concern on my mind while I was serving in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, this luxury, and I can tell you from the stories that I heard from many of my colleagues in uniform while I was deployed, while their mind often drifted to what was going on at home at their children's lives and their families' lives and their children's education or other personal things that were going on in their lives at home, this was not a luxury that was shared by others, and the luxury that I had not having to worry about my children's education while I was deployed. The last concern a soldier should have on their mind while deployed is the quality of the education that their child is receiving back home. Most people don't realize that our national security and military readiness is significantly affected by the quality of education made available to children of service members. A crucial factor for a service member to either accept a new assignment or decide to leave the military service altogether are the educational opportunities available for their children. Military Times conducted a recent survey which showed that 35% of military family respondents agreed that a significant factor in their decision to stay in or leave military service depended on the education choices available for their family. Unfortunately, military-connected children are too often assigned to school districts that are closest to the military base, regardless of the quality of education. For example, 80% of the 1.2 million of school-age military-connected children in the U.S. attend traditional public schools. In my home state of Indiana, there are 6 military bases. Fortunately, as I discussed earlier, Indiana has a robust school choice program. However, more than half of all active duty military families live in states with no school choice options at all. No tuition tax credit scholarship program, no education savings account option, or no voucher program. With that, let's look at some interesting data points to see exactly why choice in education appeals to military families. Compared to the national parent average, military parents are statistically more likely to accommodate their children's education. Specifically, they are more likely to help with homework at least one night a week, transport their child to and from school, have a family or friend look after the child when they're unable or serving elsewhere, and they're also more willing to pay for tutoring. To borrow from Lindsay's research of current and former military families and parents, 44% have taken an additional job to secure their children's education, compared to 22% of the national parent average. 37% changed jobs to secure their children's education, compared to 14% of the national parent average. 37% moved closer to a school to secure their children's education, compared to 17% of the national parent average. And 32% took out a new loan to secure their children's education, compared to 11% of the national parent average. The survey results are clear. School choice is attractive to military parents. We must make access to quality education as easy as possible for our service members' families. So in conclusion, improving morale of service members and ensuring readiness of our military starts at home with their families. As Congress works to equip our soldiers in the field, we must also do more to work to equip their families at home. That's why I have been working on legislation that would allow for federal impact aid dollars traditionally paid to local school districts with military families to instead be utilized by parents directly through education savings accounts to provide for choice and flexibility. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure our military families have access to the quality education they deserve. I'm grateful for the work of the Heritage Foundation and others who have already paved the way to begin working on concepts and legislation like that. And with that, I'll close and be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Great. Well, we'll open it up to questions. If you have a question for the Congressman, just raise your hand and Gabe will come around. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Will Estrada with Homeschool Legal Defense. Thank you so much, Congressman, for all that you do. My question is, and I should probably know the answer, but I don't, is there a sense of how many children are being homeschooled in military families? I saw the numbers from Heritage that there's about 800,000 kids, 750,000 of them are in public schools or DoD schools. So does that mean that there's 50,000 in private schools? How many are in homeschools? Is there any sense of those sort of numbers?
I don't know. I would defer to Lindsay on whether or not that question can be answered. I would say anecdotally, many of the families that I served with, more than the norm of the general population that I was accustomed to, homeschooled their families. So I can imagine it's a much higher percentage. But
It is. So it's about twice the rate of the civilian population. So, which you know the civilian numbers, I know. Perfect. So about 7% or so are homeschooling. And then, of course, there's a private school portion of that, too, beyond the homeschooling community. Great question. Thank you.
Though I mean, just having served and serving with a number of families, it's often the deeply personal story that you hear from military parents when they move from one school district to another, and the challenges for the children that come about with that, and doing everything that they can to strive the best, to find the best educational choice for their families, which oftentimes is homeschooling. Oftentimes it's moving to a school district that might be quite a bit further away from the military base to find the best educational option. That's why I believe that legislation like this could fix this problem for many military families and give them better access to better choices for their children's education.
Great. I'll ask one question, moderator prerogative, but you've had a long history with the armed forces. Can you talk a little bit? Do you see this as a national security issue? Is it a retention issue? Is it a recruitment issue? How are you sort of putting that in context with your military service?
Well, I also serve on the House Armed Services Committee, which was mentioned before, and when you read some of the stories, like stories that there's a story, I forget where I read it this morning, but about the Army watering down some of the criteria to be able to attract more soldiers into the Army. What it's going to take to rebuild the military. The Heritage Foundation has done so much research on where we are, how our military has fallen so far behind, what it's going to take to recruit new soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to step up and serve. This is a recruitment tool. It's a morale issue, and it's also an issue that's related to our ability to retain the seasoned talent that we need in all ranks in the military. It's important in the military as we invest in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we invest in training soldiers and our service members to prepare them to go and fight on our behalf, to deploy, to go abroad and do what we expect them to do. It's important that while we're investing in training, that we're also investing in their families at home to be able to retain those service members in the military to combat what we face.
I saw a question over here. Oh.
Yes, thank you so much. So coming from an Air Force family, myself, granted, our family was probably a little abnormal. We moved every 2 to 3 years of my life. So can you talk about maybe the technicality, if those conversations have even happened, how this would work crossing state borders, crossing countries? So if we were able to get the accounts, situated, how would that work out in those scenarios for military families?
Well, a lot of details to be fleshed out, but you hit on, I think, the one of the most important components of this endeavor, and the flexibility that an ESA would provide to military families to be able to take that the money from that ESA and invest it as families like yours did move from state to state and even move abroad, that those families can make the best choices available to them wherever they are based on the investment in the ESA. Now, like many of you, my educational philosophy as an elected official is that we should empower the states to do more and the federal government to do much less of anything at all. And that is a tenet of my political philosophy from my time in the State House, where we worked to make Indiana the leader in educational reform and educational choice of almost every other state in the country, and it's what I brought to Washington, D.C. as a member of Congress. So while I want the federal government to do less, there is a direct role related to our national security that the Congress can play, that the federal government can play in establishing ESAs for military families to be able to draft that ESA and take it with them wherever they go, to be able to the durability of that, to be able to make those best decisions wherever they go, whether CONUS or OCONUS, to make the best educational choice for their family. I don't know, Lindsay, if you want to talk more about how some of the specifics of how that would work, but those are parts of the details that we're working as we're drafting the legislation to make sure that works.
Yeah, I'll just add, that was great. I'll just add that is one of the great facets, in my opinion, of an ESA, is that any unused funds you have can roll over year to year. They can follow you state to state. I think that's exactly right. As the details get worked out, what that would look like when you move state to state. But certainly any unused funds that you have would follow you year to year. And if the states are any indication, families end up having a good amount of unused funds when they enter an ESA option in the state. So bodes well. Thank you. We'll take one more if there's, yes, sir. Or actually, you want to go in the back here? Thank you.
Hey there, how are you? Just a quick question about the timeline and the introduction of this bill. And then two, I'm curious about sort of the repercussions in the public school districts that get some of these funds. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much for the question. We are currently in the drafting stage of preparing the legislation. We hope to introduce it very soon, but we don't want to do it prematurely. So we're working through some of the details and drafting. I don't have a good answer for you on that, but definitely a matter of days or weeks, not a matter of months before we'll have it prepared. As I mentioned in my prepared remarks, and with my experience in Indiana, I wholeheartedly believe that school choice improves public education, public schools. And what we saw in our state as we passed a number of educational reform initiatives and legislation, we saw public schools begin to compete with private schools. Oftentimes there would be, in my hometown in Columbia City, the elementary school had banners out front that boasted of their test scores. And all of a sudden you begin to see examples of that around the state of Indiana and recognize that public schools in a competitive environment, competition makes public and private schools better. And ESAs is one opportunity to continue to create a competitive environment among educational institutions that improves education for all of them, ultimately to provide a better education for our kids. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
We'll now welcome up Inez Stepman. She's going to moderate, and the rest of the panelists can come up as well. She's going to moderate what I think will be quite an interesting discussion and really provide a lot of context for what Congressman Banks was talking about on education choice.
I know he just left, but thank you to Representative Banks for his service, for his remarks, and also for being a champion on this issue. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here at the Heritage Foundation with all of you. I'm Inez Stepman, as Lindsay mentioned, and I'm the Director of Education and Workforce Task Force at the American Legislative Exchange Council. ALEC has long championed school choice and education savings accounts in particular, and we've done so at the state policy level. While it is right and proper that the primary vehicle for these crucial reforms is at the state level, there are some reforms that are appropriate at the federal level. Among them, of course, anything having to do with national security and our nation's finest who serve in uniform. We, along with the Heritage Foundation, Texas Public Policy Foundation, and other think tanks and stakeholders around the nation, published an open letter in favor of giving our military families more educational options, because no man or woman who sacrifices by putting on the uniform for all of our behalf should ever have to worry about that they are also sacrificing their children's educations or their educational options. So that's more than enough from me. We have a great panel for you for today. You've already heard about Lindsay Burke, the lovely and talented Lindsay Burke, Director of the Heritage Center for Education Policy. Paul DePerna is Vice President of Research and Innovation for EdChoice. Paul's research interests include surveys and polling on K-12 education and school choice reforms, and he has developed and reported more than 30 state and national surveys. Previously, Paul served as the Assistant Director for the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution. Brooke Medina is a Communications Fellow with the North Carolina-based Civitas Institute and also a military wife and mother. James J. Carafano is a leading expert in national security and foreign policy challenges and the Heritage Foundation's Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. He's also the E.W. Richardson Fellow and Director of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies. He's also a 25-year Army veteran, a graduate of West Point, and holds a master's degree and a doctorate from Georgetown University, as well as a master's in strategy from the U.S. Army War College. Please welcome our panel.
Great. Thank you, Inez. And thanks again, everybody, for being here. It was really great to hear from Congressman Banks on why this is a priority for him. At Heritage, we have really put a lot of work over the past year or so into prioritizing this issue in particular on advancing education choice for service members and their families. As Inez alluded to, this is one of those areas where this is an option that has a clear constitutional warrant, which cannot be said about the vast majority of education programs at the federal level. So this is something that we think is entirely appropriate through federal policy to advance, that is school choice for military families, but it's also just good policy. And it's good policy for a lot of the reasons that you'll hear Paul talk about in a minute, which are the survey findings that we've just come out with about a month ago now, where we were able to, in conjunction with EdChoice, to survey active duty and veteran families to really get a sense of where they fall on these issues. It's one thing for us to put out good policy, but knowing how the armed services and their families feel themselves was really critical for us and important in our calculation. But I'll just reiterate a couple of things. So the Congressman noted a really important finding that we have mentioned quite a few times because it was something that catalyzed a lot of our research over the past year. And that was this Military Times survey finding that came out last year that said that 35% of respondents in their survey had thought about leaving military service altogether because of the schools that their children would have to attend when they changed duty stations. And that really shook us. When we saw that finding, we said there's something here that needs to be addressed and can be addressed through federal policy. And so that really catalyzed our thinking about it. The other thing that really spurred our interest was something that was really shocking when we surveyed where military families and their children across the country live. We were able to look at those 1.2 million military-connected children, look at where they are in the states, and see that only half live in states with any type of school choice option at all. Even the most basic public school choice options are not available to most military families. And so that was something, again, that really spurred us to think about how we could modernize existing federal policy to better meet the needs of service members and their children. And so as I mentioned earlier, the federal government has an exclusive responsibility and a mandate to oversee the national defense. And this is why, in our opinion, there is a special place at the U.S. Department of Education for the education of military-connected children. It's why it's there, it's why it's appropriate that it's there, and it's why we argue that there is a constitutional warrant to this program. The Congressman mentioned Impact Aid specifically at the end of his remarks, and for the uninitiated, which I think is most people, Impact Aid is sort of somewhat of an obscure federal education program, but it's a big one, and it impacts, no pun intended, a lot of kids. It's a $1.3 billion program, and it really has a dual purpose, Impact Aid. The first, if you read the Impact Aid statute, is to support the education of federally connected children. And federally connected is both kids who are military connected, and there are some other federally connected children within that program. So Native American children on tribal lands fall within that paradigm as well. Some other federally connected children as well who aren't military. So that's the first component of it, is to support the education of military connected kids. And then it is also to compensate local areas for lost tax revenue due to a federal presence. I think that second piece is often what gets talked about and touted the most when it comes to Impact Aid. As you'll hear, Impact Aid is a program to provide funding for displaced local property tax base. But the first part of that is what is really critical, and I would argue the second piece of that we should think about exactly the same way. Regardless of whether it's a lost property tax base, these are federal funds that are designed to educate the children that reside in a particular geographic region. And so if we think about how funding should be delivered, federal, state, local, or otherwise, in our opinion, every dollar that we spend should be student-centered and portable. It is about the education of these children, not the physical plant in which those dollars are following them to. And so we should really be neutral with regard to where those kids are receiving their education and allow parents to choose. So there are lots of vehicles, I think, for how we could think about advancing education choice for military-connected families at the federal level. Impact Aid is but one vehicle that we think is appropriate, But the way that we have started to operationalize this idea is to say, well, what if instead of funneling that $1.3 billion to government-run school districts and then assigning those military-connected kids to those school districts, what if we allowed those dollars to flow to families themselves and then empowered those families to choose any option using an ESA? So as the congressman said, 90% of what would have been spent on the kid, they could then pay for private school tuition, online learning, special education services and therapies, textbooks, tutoring, anything that they needed to support their education is something that they could finance with their ESA. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they could roll over unused funds year to year. So these would be the dollars that are already being spent, deposited into a parent-controlled ESA. So I think that that's really good policy. It's something that we've seen just grow amazingly quickly in the states, in the school choice landscape that's out there. We now have 6 states that have ESA laws in place. And so building upon that through a vehicle that we think is appropriate through federal policy would give us a really good chance of advancing education choice nationally at the federal level in a way that is appropriate through federal policy. So I'll leave it at that and hand it over to Paul, because Paul really has some of the most interesting data, I think, to date. And it's really the survey, if you have a copy, they're outside, but the survey that EdChoice was able to publish is the first survey of its kind to ever survey military families on their opinions on school choice and ESAs specifically. So it was really exciting to see those findings.
Thanks, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here today at the Heritage Foundation, honoring Veterans Day and honoring our military families to discuss our recent survey of U.S. military service members, veterans, and their spouses. I just want to take a special a second to give a special thanks to Lindsay and Heritage and Ann Ryland, our co-author, for all the work that that you guys have been doing over the last year on military family issues and how they can intersect with school choice policy and issues. So for those of you who may not be familiar with EdChoice, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that's based in Indianapolis. Nobel laureate economist Milton Friedman, with his wife Rose, founded our organization about 20 years ago. And it was known then as the Milton and Rose D. Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. Last year, we changed our name as part of a long-term transition plan to EdChoice. And we conduct empirical research on questions relating to school choice issues in American K-12 education. And we focus much of our work at the state level. And we partner with a lot of local stakeholders and groups to raise awareness and better understanding about educational choice policies and programs and what it can mean to have a more universal educational choice capability for parents' schooling decisions and capacities. And so back in April, Lindsay, Ann Ryland, and Jenny Gentles and I were on the phone discussing the possibilities for school choice, specifically education savings accounts, as a meaningful pathway for U.S. military families to have more flexibility and access and control over the schooling decisions for their children and to provide them even other educational services as well. And so they had proposed a survey of military families, and since EdChoice regularly conducts state and national surveys, I thought that their idea was a terrific one, and we all agreed this could really be a worthwhile and timely project, especially considering the elevated public attention and debate around the potential federal role for bringing more parental choice in K-12 education. So going into this project, we understood that military families have substantial, unique challenges that do not really factor into the day-to-day or long-term considerations of non-military families. As Congressman Banks and Lindsay just a moment ago had cited previous surveys that shed some light on these realities. The Blue Star Families Survey is an annual one that really gives a lot of information about military families and their unique needs, and as well as this Military Time Survey that came out in the last year. And so we know that 35% of respondents to that Military Time Survey said that dissatisfaction with their child's education was a significant factor for leaving the military. So in late June and July of this year, our survey partner, Braun Research, completed 600 online interviews with active duty military or their spouses, and they also conducted an additional 600 live phone interviews with veterans and their spouses. And Table 2 in our report breaks out the various demographics and subgroups just to give you a sense of how those demographics are represented in our overall sample of 1,200 military respondents. And we give a good bit of detail about the methodology for our survey in the appendices of the report. So about 3/4 of our questionnaire focused on questions regarding K-12 and educational choice subjects. And so I'll quickly share some results and findings on that part of the survey. So what did we learn? On average, current school parents give positive ratings to their school districts on a range of activities. But we also found that compared to other services, those parents are less likely to give such high ratings and marks to those services that are specific to the needs and priorities of the military family's context. So there's a little bit of a difference there in terms of how well local school districts may be addressing the needs of military-connected students and families. We also found that military parents are very engaged and proactive when it comes to supporting the educational activities of their children. Congressman Banks cited some of these statistics in his excellent remarks. And so the military parents tried, for example, a range of school types where we found that at least a third, about 34%, said that they had tried a public charter school for at least a half year. Another 31% said that they tried a private school. And then 22% said that they had homeschooled their child for at least a half year. So there was a question earlier about homeschooling and what's the level of homeschooling among military families. It appears that there is this inclination to try to provide that type of schooling environment for their children. It's to build in more flexibility for the educational needs of their child. And so we also looked at questions. We took questions from our annual national survey that we asked parents, and we had asked the current and former school parents in our military survey about what kinds of activities, what kind of supports they give their child. And as Congressman Banks had noted, I mean, military parents are twice as likely to take an additional job, change their job, or move closer to a school in order to support their kids' education. I mean, they're almost 3 times as likely to take out a loan to support their child's education. So these are much higher levels than the national parent average that we find in our national survey. Military parents are also substantially more likely to change their daily routines than the average parent, pay for before and after care services, which as a father of 2 young girls, and those kinds of services that are just make it that much more it's very helpful to families. So it's something that I can relate with. The military families also pay for a child's transportation to or from a school at a much higher rate than the average school parent. And so then we also found in our survey that there are signs of disconnect between what military families say that they want in our interviews and what we know is happening generally in the real world. It was noted before that about 80% of military-connected students are attending local public schools, but in our survey, 35% of current school parents said that a public district school is their first choice. So there's a gap there, and it appears to be a structural disconnect. So this emerging portrait of military families' experiences and activities and preferences point to the potential for an education savings account program as a way to address these kind of structural misalignments and gaps and to meet the multifaceted needs and priorities that also intertwine with relatively high levels of support and engagements among military parents and students. So what did we find about the military respondents' views about ESAs? And so based on the overall sample, military respondents were almost 5 times more likely to support education savings accounts as opposed to compared to opposing them. So 72% said that they strongly or somewhat favored education savings account, compared to just 15% who said that they strongly or somewhat opposed education savings account. Current school parents, so a subsample, were even more likely to support the education savings account. 78%, almost 8 out of 10 current school parents in a military family supported ESAs, and just 14% opposed ESAs. And that group is more likely to support whether we give a description or just at the baseline. So there's this appetite for change and for something and for some type of flexibility. And we found that in a follow-up question where we asked, why did you support ESAs? And 30% said that it was access to a better academic environment, and almost the same number, 28% said that more freedom and flexibility for parents was the most important reason why they said they supported ESAs. And there was also about 1 out of 5 said that they liked ESAs because it gave them a focus on more individual attention. And so that said, reformers and policymakers should also be prepared to recognize and address the concerns of those who said they opposed ESAs. And about 40% of the people who said that they opposed ESAs said they were worried about diverting public funds away from public schools. And that's a common finding that we see in our other surveys as well. So, and that was the biggest reservation expressed by opponents, which was a very small percentage of the overall. And so finally, we asked a hypothetical question that if Congress considered a proposal to establish ESAs for military-connected students, would they favor or oppose that type of plan? And an overwhelming majority said they supported this kind of ESA proposal. 71% said that they supported, and 15% said that they opposed that kind of plan. So okay, I'll stop there, and we'll be happy to answer any questions in the discussion. Thank you. Thanks.
Sure. So we're going to move to Brooke, and I have a couple questions. So we've just heard Paul highlight some of those survey results, and as a representative up here, actually one of two who's actually been in the military and experienced it for yourself and your family as a family member. Do you think that the results that Paul just highlighted are reflective of what you've seen from friends, family, and other colleagues?
Yes, I would say so. Because military families are so limited in many of the choices that or decisions that go on in their lives and what they have control over. And this is one area in which, for a parent, especially when if you're a geographic bachelor, so where your spouse is deployed or gone for an extended period at a school, where a parent of a child can actually operate some semblance of control over what their children are learning, or the environment that they're in, or the access that they have to crucial education opportunities. So I definitely see this as representative of the military community that I'm a part of.
Let's keep going sort of with your experiences. What are some of the unique education challenges that either you've faced or people who have faced when it comes to deployments, as you mentioned, or extended absences of the family member who's in the service? And how have those challenges fed into the decisions that you've made regarding your children's educations?
Mm-hmm. So deployments, first and foremost, are probably the most emotionally tumultuous times for military children, I would say. And that's going to pour over into their school life, whether or not they're in a community that supports them by way of their teacher or fellow students that have similar shared experiences. So the deployment aspect and the effects that it has upon the family are significant emotionally, like I said, but also just my own experience. For example, my husband deployed in December to Afghanistan several years back. And so that was the middle of the school year, right? Well, we lived in North Carolina at the time. He was deploying out of Washington State. He had to be there at least 6 weeks in advance to prepare for deployment. So we could have either said goodbye 6 weeks prior and missed out while he was still stateside and stayed in North Carolina. But our family decided to homeschool our children, and so we went along with him. And that portability, was crucial for our family at least being together for an additional 6 weeks that we could have not have otherwise had if we didn't have some sort of flexibility within our grasp. So yeah.
So on that thread then, if we were to change the funding, if we were to, so in the example you just gave, the federal government would be paying the local school in North Carolina, regardless of the fact that your family made the decision to homeschool your kids and then to be able to take advantage of that flexibility and stay with the family, like keep the family together for an additional 6 weeks. If Congress were to change the way they fund the education, fund your children's educations, how would that impact the decisions you've made or hope to make? Or if not for your family, maybe for a family you might know, what kind of opportunities might that open up for you?
So a lot of families, because especially as you heard Paul cite just how important military families value, how highly we value education and are willing to make these sacrifices, I would say that would free up a lot of families to be willing to either homeschool or take the education funds with them to the new duty station and finish out the school year there. Whereas right now, if they are in a public school or a private school and they're essentially locked into that one and their parent has to go to another duty station, it ties their hands effectively in a lot of ways. Whereas if we had the education savings accounts, of course, it would offer immense flexibility that we, up until this point, have not been able to access. And I have a lot of friends that are in these situations. Our family has chosen to homeschool. We've made the financial sacrifices to do so by me staying at home for over 8 years is what we had homeschooled for. But there are other families that are unable to do that. There are a variety of reasons why. And so even if they had the opportunity to send their child to another school in another district through an education savings account, I think that would have immense positive impact on these families.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. And I'd like to move on to Mr. Carafano there at the end. I know that your background is in national security, right? So this is probably your first education policy panel. I don't know, maybe not. But you come at this from the national security perspective. Why do you think that the education opportunities that are available to the children of service members and children of military families, why would you consider that a national security issue?
Well, for starters, the thing that the Department of Defense spends the most money on is people. We spend more money on people than ammunition, buying weapons, anything else. So it is the biggest account in DoD. So anything that affects the effectiveness of managing the workforce actually has an enormous impact on the overall the overall ability of DoD to get the best bang for its buck overall. So they mentioned recruiting and retention. So why recruiting is an issue is because the military actually recruits. I mean, it actually has to go out and find people. Very few people just walk in and sign up. So that means there's an acquisition cost there. And the harder it is to acquire people, the more money you have to put into that. And so that's additional cost as well. And why that's significant is by estimates, about 70% of the youth age population that we like to recruit for the military are ineligible for military service. That's because of a physical, they're not physically fit, they don't have the education requirement, they don't have the moral requirement, they have some kind of legal problems. So you're actually recruiting from 30% of the American population that's eligible to serve. And if I could give you a worker that had a high school education and not a criminal record, you would want to hire that person, right? So there's competition for that person, right? Increasingly, people that join the military are either married and already have children or going to have children soon after they enter the military. That's a big shift dramatic shift in the nature of the acquired military force over the years. So people come into the military now where family quality of life is an issue for actually joining the military. So that's a big deal. So that significantly impacts on the ability, not just the ability to compete to get quality people, but actually it lowers the acquisition cost because you're offering a better package. So it is actually a really, really big deal. So the way retention works is, I mean, this is obvious, right? If you've trained somebody, you know, if I've trained you to do a job, it's a lot cheaper to keep you, right, than have you leave and then train somebody else to do that, because there's a cost in that training, right? Not just in money, but in terms of mind. In the military, you spend about a 30-year career in schools. It's an enormous amount that we invest in that, right? And so retention's funny in the military. The retention we like to do is we don't have to retain everybody, because the military gets smaller as you get older, right? You need, you know, less sergeants than privates, like, you know, less captains and lieutenants and on up. So it's like a pyramid. So they don't have to retain everybody. But the way the military likes is they'd like to retain the people they want as opposed to the people they don't want, right? So they'd much rather that the retention decision be made by them and whether they want to keep you, rather than the issue being whether you want to stay or not, right? So giving people a reason to stay is really, really important. And again, because increasingly most of our service rep members are increasingly married and have children, family quality of life is an important factor, and education is one of the absolutely critical factors in that. So just a real quick comment on two things of why this is particularly important. One is, and unique about military families, a lot of military families, the kids are special in different ways. So for example, language is a big deal, right? Either they have language skills because they were stationed overseas, or they're going to be stationed overseas. So acquisition of language skills is important to them. And not every place you're going to go in the country is going to necessarily have a full suite of language capabilities that's going to service that child. STEM's another big issue. Increasingly, a lot of military skill sets are very technical, and children are growing up in families where dad is a robotics engineer, or he works in aviation, or he works in another technical field, and they might want to be inspired to follow on to that. And again, not every school district is going to offer that child the range of technical skills that they might want. So having military families, I think in some ways and because they're only going to be there for a couple of years, they really can't afford to waste that time in their child's education by not being able to more targetedly delivering special skill sets that they need. And I just wanted to comment briefly on the homeschooling issue, because it is interesting that military homeschool at a higher rate than civilian, but there are a lot of additional challenges in that you don't see in the civilian world. So one is, you just expressed that, right? Which is, it's not just that one spouse is teaching and one spouse is not. It's when there's only one spouse there, right? That's a unique homeschooling situation where you're not just the teacher, but you're the only parent on station. That's a lot of pressure. And increasingly, we're also seeing a lot of military families where we have dual service members. So husband and wife are both in the military. They're both subject to deployment, and one could deploy and one might not. So even though homeschooling might be a really attractive option for them, and it's popular because it's very effective, it can put a lot of extra pressure on militaries, and also a lot of times, since they oftentimes move into high cost areas, the option of one parent staying at home and not bringing in revenue so they can homeschool is often not attractive. Say, for example, if you're posted in places like California where you have a really high cost of living. So even though it is very attractive for them, you can see where the option in some places to have a school choice option would significantly ease the pressure on them as they're making this decision to move around and educate their children.
So I have one final question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience and see what questions you all might come up with. You've covered, I think, the dollar and cents costs, as well as the national security imperative to retention and to recruitment. Brooke, I'd love to have you weigh in on this question as well as Jim. What are some of the soft costs, and then the flip side, what might be the soft benefit of easing? I mean, we all know that our military families carry tremendous burdens that the average civilian does not have to carry. What might be the costs or benefits of easing this part of the burden, right? Because I can't imagine how difficult it must be to try to, keep your mind on your work. Halfway across the world, you're already separated from your family. And then to have to worry, well, maybe my child is not in the best school for them. Maybe my child is having a hard time socially at school, and that school is not the best place for them from that perspective. Or from any of the parent worries, it just must be an enormous burden on top of the sacrifices that you're already asked to make. So I'd love to get both of your comments on those burdens, and then how this policy might help ease some of those, at least to some extent.
First and foremost, as a mother of 4 children, the emotional cost of it regarding having just this control and input from your children over where they could attend school, that would be enormous for a lot of military families. So no longer, if ESAs became a thing for military families, no longer would you just be restricted to, okay, I can live right here next to the base or on base, and I have to go to the school right here. But no, actually, I have opportunities now where this is where my child, based on their unique needs or based on the community that I want them to be a part of, can have access to now, because we have that freedom that and that choice at this moment. So I would say, so emotional, academic, certainly, that is something, especially with all the different forms of educating a child, whether that be Montessori, classical, unit-based. So there's so many different options. Well, not every duty station or the schools closest to each duty station are going to offer those. And like Mr. Carafano said, there is an increasing need for maybe more language immersion opportunities for military children who are stationed outside of the continental U.S. There are STEM-based activities that would be highly beneficial to military families. So definitely emotional, and then clearly the academic.
So I can think of two, one from personal experience. So one is as you go around the United States, you don't have a uniformity of special needs education for children in public schools. And of course, you can go into a place where there isn't one, and you can sue the school district, and then you win your court case, and then they'll pay for your child to go to private school, which is what I did, right? That's not a fun process. It's extremely stressful, right? So rather than going through that, if you could find a school that provides for those kinds of needs without having to go through a whole legal process to get the government to pay for them, that would be kind of cool. The other one is like I said, only 30% of this age group is eligible for military service. It may not shock you that a lot of the people in that group that are 30% qualified are children of military service members, right? So since we're recruiting a lot of children of military service members to be in the military, it would be really cool if they had a really good education and they were really good kids, because that's actually one of our strongest recruiting pools.
Great. I don't know, Lindsay, if we have time for some questions.
Yeah, we'll open it up if you have questions. And I'll just underscore one thing Paul said that I think is really important, just that mismatch piece that you mentioned earlier, that 35% of respondents in this poll said that they would choose a public school, yet 80% of military families are attending public school. I think that discrepancy is really worth highlighting. So, but we'll open it up to questions. If you have any, just raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Hi there, my name is Jared with the Daily Signal. My question is for you, Brooke. Say, for instance, these ESA programs get passed. What's the best way to get the message out to military families who may not know that these, A, programs exist, and B, that these programs will help them in a lot of these struggles? What's the best way to communicate to military people this is for them?
Well, as Paul had mentioned, military families are very proactive in their children's education to the extent that they're allowed and able to be. So I would say media, but primarily social media. That is where military families, for purposes of communicating with their spouses while they're deployed, family members that live far away. This is it's a great platform for military families to access information. I know the Civitas Institute, where I work at, we started a Facebook group for military families in North Carolina that is dedicated to informing them and educating them on the school choice options available in our state. So definitely that one is one way, and word of mouth. I mean, it's powerful within the military community, especially because we are a small and tight-knit community. Especially if it's good news like this, it will travel fast. So,
Will Estrada with Homeschool Legal Defense. My question is for Brooke. Brooke, very excited to hear that you homeschooled your children. And so, in addition to this proposal, which would help help all military families who are educating their children, whether or not they homeschool, what are specific ways that either outside organizations or policymakers can help military families who are homeschooling or thinking about homeschooling?
I would say, so I have a friend who lives in Germany, for example. Homeschooling is illegal in Germany for the German public, but is obviously an option that military families have available. So looking for ways to make policy, finding this continuity of policy on the state level too, which obviously homeschooling is legal within the states, but creating some sort of network wherein military families can have access, especially if they're homeschooling, to information that will bring them up to speed on the homeschool laws there in their state, which HSLDA may already have that. But whenever we're assigned to a new duty station, I am, looking up information, trying to find out how I need to establish the homeschool in that state. And some states are incredibly homeschool friendly, such as North Carolina, whereas there are others that some of my friends live in where it's jumping through a lot of hoops. So even some continuity on the policy level for homeschool or families would be phenomenal.
Great. No, go ahead. Yeah. This last one. Yeah, this is great. We like ending on technical notes.
Yeah,
so.
good. I guess I just keep drawing from my own experiences. So, child of 3, military. I think Jim obviously hit on this really well with the languages and so forth, living overseas. How would this work? And I know you guys are still in it. I haven't read up as much as I could probably. But how would it work? Kind of two-part question. If you have multiple children, is it like a cap on each child? Is it a pool that you pull from? And then the second one is, if you are in the military and you're stationed overseas, does that affect only DOD schools or DODIA schools, or would you, be able to take that to the local schools overseas?
And
Yep.
let me piggyback on the question and ask you a question. So I know, so a lot of times when you're homeschooling, you get to certain ages and certain technical teaching that you have to go outside the home, right? So like you need a lab for science class or music lessons or something like that. Is there a role for charter schools in that as well?
Charters for sure, but certainly with an ESA, you could finance that as well. So sort of all of the above is our
Yeah, and so the point is that that's really important for military families who, as you're going around, when you literally a typical military career, you're only in one place for 2 or 3 years. You have to be really efficient in the use of your child's education. And if you get to a place and they're just in the years where they need a science lab, you just can't not do that, right?
That's right. Yeah, so, and great question, two-part question. So if you have 3 kids and you're traveling around and getting deployed, each of those children would have their own account, assuming that they're currently, if we're thinking about impact aid, and again, there could be many vehicles. We've written a lot about the impact aid vehicle. Assuming each of those 3 kids were in the impact aid formula, which just means they probably were, because they were probably all living under your roof and attending the same school, then they would each qualify for a separate account that you would control. We're getting more and more sophisticated with ESAs, where you can put little codes on the cards and make sure that they connect with individual children. In terms of moving either state to state or overseas, I think the Congressman was right. This is still formative in a way and thinking through all the details, but one option would be that if you live in a state where you generate a high amount of per pupil impact aid dollars, you would get that amount. Then when you move to the next state, depending on what you generated as a family is what you would get in the next state, but any unused funds, like I mentioned earlier, would follow you to the next state. That's one way to think about it. There are other ways to think about it as well, but if it were just impact aid, that's probably the best mechanism for doing that. And then the same would hold for overseas as well. Any unused funds would follow you.
I'd just like to add, those, just to clarify something, those are funds the federal government and all of us as taxpayers are already allocated to the education of military-connected children. This is just giving those families more control over that money. And I would hope that there aren't, we don't have a language, but I would hope that there weren't limitations, that you could take advantage of all the local options, just as you would with your own money.
Yeah, that's exactly how we've thought about it. If you want it, there's an account with your name on it at wherever it would be, DOD or Ed. And if you wanted to go an ESA route, you could tap into it and take it with you. Great. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to Inez for moderating. Thanks to all the panelists, and again to Congressman Banks, but really appreciate you all being here. Thank you.